I'm Grace LaConte, and just wanted to open up a discussion about the topic of Chernobyl, which was a disaster that happened in the Ukraine, which was part of the USSR in 1986. I'd love to hear your comments on what happened. What was your experience when Chernobyl happened, what you heard on the news, what might have gone through your mind. It was 1986, so I was 6 years old. I'm 39 now. I was 6 and I was living in Italy at the time, in northern Italy. And even as a 6-year-old in first grade, I still remember hearing on the news that a terrible disaster had happened. And I remember hearing the words poison and air and breathing, and it was terrifying. I still remember my parents being completely horrified that this was going on just a few countries away. And as the news continued to get more serious about how much it was affecting all of Europe, really, and how the clouds of nuclear fallout were coming into our area, and as a 6-year-old, I couldn't really process exactly what was going on, but I just remember being really scared to breathe. The air was filled with what we knew at the time to be possibly toxic poison. We didn't really know much about it at the time. Nuclear energy wasn't really a big thing, but as an adult now, I look back and just see how dangerous the situation was, and I didn't even realize until I started watching HBO's new show how much worse it could have become if certain measures hadn't been taken. So I just find this entire conversation really interesting. I'd love to hear comments if you want to leave some questions or comments about how you've experienced this real tragedy that happened in the Ukraine. But every Monday night for the next 3 weeks, they're adding more episodes of this show, Chernobyl. It's a city in Ukraine, which was part of the USSR. They created this massive several segment nuclear power plant to generate electricity and also to provide potentially weapons for attacks that they were expecting from the United States and other allies. And it was a pretty scary situation to be in during the Cold War, because Western Europe was constantly on alert, and Eastern Europe and countries that were part of the USSR had built these systems to protect them against possible attacks. And so the nuclear generators were part of that system to provide energy, but also to keep them safe and to provide nuclear weapons. It was all kind of connected. So I found it interesting as I've been doing more research that the Chernobyl disaster happened partly due to bureaucracy. It was not necessarily a breakdown in the mechanics, although that's part of what led to the meltdown. It was also because of a lack of communication between different groups of people. There was a similar near disaster that had happened at another nuclear plant just a few weeks prior to the Chernobyl disaster. And that plant did not communicate what happened because of all these layers of bureaucracy and the Soviet mentality at the time of not wanting to share information, not wanting to show weakness. There was just complete, I guess, a distrust possibly of different groups of people. So there was a strong possibility that Chernobyl may not have happened if this other plant where a similar event occurred, if that information had been shared, then the sequence of events that led to the meltdown of the core in reactor 4 would not have happened. And there were several other things that went wrong that caused alarms not to be set up correctly, even though it went against protocol. There were people that should have been aware of things that were not. I mean, of course, as with any disaster, there are a lot of things that go wrong in sequence, and kind of like the worst possible storm, the perfect storm, so to speak. But I just have a lot of thoughts about this. So first of all, if you haven't already, and if you have access to HBO, definitely check out the 5-part series, Chernobyl. It is amazing. It is very factually accurate, and I've heard from a lot of comments from folks who've lived in Belarus and Ukraine and other regions in Eastern Europe that the decor and the clothing are very realistic. They're very true to what the time period in 1986 was in that part of the country, in the part of the world. It looked very familiar to me too. The colors of the wallpapers, the clothing style, it felt very authentic. Some of the actors are really big names. Seeing their talent come through, even though they all have English, British accents, which is I thought that was kind of annoying. I think some Ukrainians are happy that those actors did not try to imitate their own language, but I found it kind of inauthentic. That was the only thing that was inauthentic to me. But the story itself is just incredible. It doesn't focus on the experience of the bomb, it's the explosion itself. It focuses more on the stories of people who were the first responders. They called them the liquidators. People who showed up first, the firemen and firewomen, I'm sure, and other personnel who were called on to try to deliver some sort of effect to clean up the mess before it became worse. And a lot of them had no idea what they were getting into. They didn't know the impact of what a reactor core from a nuclear power plant would do to them. And even as we're progressing in the series, episode 2 is coming out, or episode 3 is coming out tomorrow. I've seen episodes 1 and 2, but episode 3 will be getting into the real, the government institution is finally coming to terms with the fact that it's about to become much worse if they don't close off certain access of this melted down reactor core to water. If that had happened, there would have been a massive explosion that would have affected millions of people for 100 years. I just had no idea. I have actually done quite a bit of research on Chernobyl. I've watched several documentaries, and I had no idea that we were close to a nuclear complete world disaster. It was extremely interesting to me to find this out. I kind of wish I'd heard from somewhere other than an HBO miniseries, because this is obviously something that occurred in history, but there has been a lot of a lack of understanding of this event because of the lack of information from the Soviet. The people involved were told not to share this information. A lot of documents were hidden or destroyed, and because of the fact that the Soviet Union was trying to hide a lot of things from the outside world, especially from the Western world, there were a lot of things that were not shared until quite recently. So this documentary has really opened my eyes to how important it was for what I call devil's advocates to really convey the importance of taking steps to stop this nuclear disaster from getting even worse. So I'm really curious to see what episode 3 is going to show us. But a couple thoughts about the show. There's been a really great podcast called Gross Anatomy with Dr. Jason Cohen. You can find it on iTunes. I found that fascinating. He actually does some commentary on popular TV and movies from his perspective as a surgeon. He's a thyroid doctor, a cancer doctor, and he did some analysis of the show and also his perspective as a physician on what it's like to face exposure to nuclear radiation, and especially how it affects the thyroid gland. So that was fascinating. I highly recommend you look him up, especially that episode about Chernobyl. This explosion happened. The townspeople in the city of Chernobyl and other cities around it did not know the extent of the damage that was happening, and it ended up having a very wide impact from fallout from radiation, mostly iodine radiation, which is the main component of what our thyroid gland and our necks picks up. So because of this nuclear component of iodine, it's extremely dangerous for the thyroid gland. So the effect of this went all over most of Eastern and Western Europe. It was especially concentrated in the Ukraine, but it went very far across even long distances, and certain areas were affected more than others. So the first The first awareness of this came from Finland because they found very, very high readings of radioactive levels. And so they started questioning what was going on, and finally the employees at Chernobyl had to make a statement that they agreed that this was happening and to start taking action to curtail the ongoing, basically it was multiple atomic bombs going on every day. That's the extent to which this was happening. And even still, the official count of deaths and diseases from the Chernobyl disaster are very low. The official count is that not many people died, and it has not been a huge catastrophic event in terms of human tragedy. But we know from a lot of research and, observations of people who've lived in this area that there are still effects from this experience. And in fact, this Dr. Jason Cohen on his podcast said that a lot of his thyroid cancer patients who are seeking treatment, he asks every time he gets a new patient with thyroid conditions, he asks if they lived in Russia or in anywhere near Ukraine and how far away they lived from Chernobyl, because a lot of times he finds that there are still people who suffer from the effects of thyroid exposure from the radiation, the iodine radiation. So a couple things that I learned from watching the show. First of all, disasters happen and they can't always be avoided. There are things that happen that we just, even if we try really hard, they still happen. But I believe that disasters are made much worse by human error. And this is just something that is part of our human condition. We tend to be very self-assured and positive, and I think sometimes that's a good thing. But especially in my work with strategic marketing and helping practitioners who have businesses to look at the future of their business, they don't always consider what could go wrong. They don't always look at the negative aspect of reality. And if you don't plan for some disasters to happen, then when they do, because they will eventually happen, some things will go wrong, then you may be very ill prepared for how to handle that type of situation. So the second thing is that the effects are always worse if we don't face reality. If we don't step into the pain of realizing that something is going on. The officials at Chernobyl had decided to be more realistic immediately and accept the responsibility that something was wrong. Then they possibly could have started the process of curtailing the radiation much, much sooner, and they may have taken more precautions to allow certain people not to be exposed as quickly or as much. There could have been a lot of things that were done differently, but they did not. They chose to ignore the problem until it was almost too late. So when we take responsibility, it can be very painful. It may not be as painful as the long-term effects of making the wrong choices, but it can feel really, really bad at first. But that's part of what we decide to do when we become leaders, and especially if you're a business owner, that's part of the mantle of responsibility, I call it, that you decide to accept all the consequences for what is happening in your business. The third point is that devil's advocates, who are individuals who can speak up about the negative things that are happening, the potentially dangerous things that you may be doing, and they speak up in a way that can help you to make better decisions. So devil's advocates are a safeguard. They protect you from possibly doing things that could destroy your business. It's so important to have at least a couple of people in your circle of influence who can speak truth to you, who can give you feedback even if you don't want to hear it. And that happened a lot in Chernobyl. There were plenty of scientists that could foresee the possible devastation of this event. I'm sure there were people along even prior to the problem happening that were aware that doing the tests in the way that they were done was probably unsafe because they did it in a sequence that caused the core to become unstable. But because of the system in place, the bureaucracy, and many other factors, they were not heard until it was much too late. So to avoid this in your own business, it's quite possible for you to avoid catastrophes, maybe not as bad as this, but certainly putting your business at risk is much, it's easier to avoid those problems if you listen to people who may have things to say to you that are truthful, even if it's quite painful to hear. So that's a safeguard. It keeps you safe from worse things happening. A fourth point, let's see. If you ignore negativity, things will go worse. I have not listened to a lot of truth tellers in my life at different points, and other times I have. And I can tell you that a lot of things go much better when you are aware of the potential problem early on. And they go much worse if you decide to ignore the common sense and the important feedback of people who do care about you and want your business to succeed, even if that is not the most pleasant thing to hear. So ignoring the feedback of somebody who wants to help your business or your goal, ignoring that is not going to help you grow. It's not going to help your business succeed. And often we want to stay in denial, don't we? We'd rather deny that things are happening that may be too terrifying for us to come face to face with. But that's the only way to make a change. We have to be aware of what's going wrong and decide to do things differently. The fifth point is that devil's advocates can reveal our flaws. So this kind of goes along with the pain or the difficulty. I have the type of personality that I can foresee what's happening. I have a futuristic strength and strength finder, and I also am not afraid to stand up and say what needs to be said, which is quite painful, to be honest, to me. It's painful for me to have this gift. It's not fun at all to let people know that I think something's wrong, or that someone's being hurt because of their decisions, or that something needs to be changed. Having this kind of foretelling is not pleasant, and it can actually feel really bad sometimes. But if I don't say something, often I see that the effect is worse. So it's not always fun to hear that you're doing things wrong, but a devil's advocate can help you to understand what those flaws are and to change, to make the adjustment. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the sixth point, I have 7 points here. The sixth point is that listening to devil's advocates and accepting their feedback takes courage. So again, with Chernobyl, if the officials had decided to listen to the scientists, a couple of the employees went right into the core to look down into the core, and that was one of the most shocking scenes in the series. The effects physically of being around that kind of high dose of poison radiation is just horrifying. But it takes courage to hear what someone has to say. And the scientists who decided to speak up and warn the government officials of what was going on, it took a lot of courage. They were potentially putting their careers at risk by saying something. They were putting themselves in harm's way. They could have been jailed or even killed for going against the party line. And they chose to speak up anyway because they knew that it could mean saving the lives of millions of people. Finally, devil's advocates, they care. And this is a point that I make to my clients when I work with them. Getting negative feedback from your patients or your customers, or even hearing negative feedback from your staff, it is actually a good sign. I know that it sounds like it's a horrible thing and you don't want to hear negative feedback, but it actually shows that someone took the time to invest in you and in your business. They took the time to tell you what was wrong. And devil's advocates are the personality type of somebody who's trying to help you change, is that they really care about you benefiting from their feedback, from the information they're trying to share. So there's an effort to avoid disaster. They're making that effort. They may not say it in a nice way or in a gentle way, and that's one of the biggest gripes people have against devil's advocates, that they're presenting all the negativity and none of the support or the next step, and that should be part of your process. But they're coming from a place of concern. So if you have a grumpy employee who's constantly bringing up the things that are going wrong, or if you aren't really sure how to handle negative feedback, consider that there's always a nugget of truth in everything that's negative. There's always a bit of truth in even the worst comments. And if you can glean from that something positive and something for which you can make a change, then you will benefit, even if it's really painful to hear at first. So I hope that these 7 points have been helpful. I really encourage you to watch the HBO series Chernobyl, as well as a lot of other documentaries on the topic of this disaster. It's so important that we consider what happened in the past in order for us to avoid doing the same in the future, both with obviously these large-scale disasters, or you can avoid things going badly for you, for your business, for your reputation, for your staff. So these are some of the examples of what you can do to listen to those who are giving feedback, even if it's painful, and making adjustments so that you can have a more successful business as you go into the future. So I'd love to have more conversations about this topic. If you would like, leave a comment below. Let me know what your experience was in going through the Chernobyl disaster, or what your thoughts are now as this topic continues to come up so many years later, from 1986 to now. So thanks so much for tuning in. And you can find more about me. I'm Grace LaConte. My website is laconteconsulting.com. I'm a marketing strategist, and I help natural health practitioners, business owners with their marketing and looking into the future so that they can be more profitable and serve ideal patients. Thanks so much for tuning in.